All right, I'm still working inside a priestess.jpg. Haven't backed up the file. All I've done is create a copy of the background layer and call it S/H. Short for Shadows Highlights, of course. And those of us who stuck with the previous exercise, we created a keyboard shortcut for Shadows Highlights. And you can get to it now by going to the image menu, choosing Adjustments, and then choosing Shadows Highlights or pressing Control-Alt-S, Command-Option-S on the Mac, which is a lot more useful to you Macintosh users than that Command-Option-V for variations, which we now know doesn't even exist on the Mac. It's under 64-bit on the Mac. It's only 32-bit, which pretty rare that you're going to run into a Mac that's set up that way. But anyway, Shadows Highlights, I digress. Let's go ahead and choose the Shadows Highlights command. Those original defaults come back up. So 35% for shadows, 0% for highlights. You can now see what all the other default settings are because the dialog box from now on is going to come up with more options revealed, because once you turn on Show More Options, it sticks. Now, if you turn it off, it'll stick too, but I recommend you leave the dialog box nice and tall with all the options revealed. You may, however, want to change these default settings, but let's go ahead and switch out the settings for this image for starters. We don't need that much brightening of the shadows, so I'm going to lower that shadows value to 10%. You might even take it down to 0 if you want to. We're really mostly concerned about the highlights, so I'll move down to the highlights, and I'll press Shift Up arrow in order to take it up to 10%. Look at the image, see what I think. Press Shift Up arrow again in order to take it up to 20%. We're starting to really temper the highlights at this point. I'll go ahead and take it up to 30%. You ask me, that's too much. So I'm going to press Shift Down arrow to keep it at 20% right there. Obviously, color correction, goodbye. Color correction, take that down to 0. Do not care for that option at all. Another thing about it, by the way in which it increases the saturation of the colors inside the image, I find to be quite unpleasant. I'm just not a big fan of the effect. All right, the next thing I do when I'm working through this dialog box, just to give you a sense of how you might work with it as well, is I try to decide whether I'm going to change my tonal width values. And in the case of this image, I'm just going to leave them set to 50%. That's what I normally do. I don't generally change those options. And then I mess with the radius values so that I can, A, avoid halos where possible, which means I increase the radius value, and B, try to bring out the detail inside of the small crevices in the image, in which case you need to decrease the radius value. So it really is a game that you're playing in order to decide which is more important. Fewer halos, big radius, or more detail excavated inside of the nooks and crannies, in which case you go with a lower radius value. What I want you to watch is this area of the hair right there, just down below that right-hand eye. If I raise the radius value, it starts to fill in. Notice that. If I lower the radius value, I can brighten it up. Not terribly concerned about brightening that up, though. I want to get rid of the halos where I can, so I'm going to take the radius value up to 100 pixels. That looks good to me. Now, you might want to play with the radius value for the highlights, and when I say you might want to play with it, you definitely want to play with it. And what I suggest you do is take this value down. I'm going to press Shift Down arrow twice in a row to take it down to 10%, and then press Shift Up arrow and just watch the results inside the image window. So this is 20%, this is 30%, this is 40%, 50%, 60%, and so on. So not seeing a big difference once we get beyond 50% here. We'd have to make a pretty big change, I suspect, to see a difference. This is 128 pixels for what that's worth. And when I was saying percent, I meant pixels for this value, by the way. So let's take it down to 50 pixels. Of course, radius is measured in pixel values. It is a resolution-dependent modification, once again, just as it is with all of the filters. I'm going to take this down to 50 for a moment, and then I'm going to increase my midtone contrast. So once again, I'll click on that value, press Shift Up arrow to incrementally raise that value, and at about 30%, I'm liking this effect. And then I could adjust my radius once again for highlights to see what kind of different effects I get. And this is ultimately why I decided in the end on 50 pixels was I thought it looked good. So these are the settings that I applied to this image. 10% shadows, 20% highlights, tonal width for both 50%, 100 radius for shadows, 50 radius for highlights, color correction 0 as always, midtone contrast 30, left the black clip and white clip alone. Let's say from now on you would like these values to appear as defaults. And this, by the way, is something you'll have to determine over time. Are you mostly using shadows highlights to bring out details in the shadows, to breathe life into those shadows, open them up? Or are you mostly using shadows highlights to temper your highlights because they're fairly out of control and you want to bring them back into the midtone range? Or is it a combination of the two? and which one should be weighted, and what should your radius values be. So if you decide what we've got so far are great defaults, and you could click on the Save As Defaults button right there, I'm going to suggest something different in just a moment. So I'm going to click OK, where this specific effect is concerned. And so just to give you a sense of what we've done, this is the before version of the image. This is the after version. Notice that we definitely have better information inside the image. That is, the highlights aren't nearly so blown away. Again, this is before and this is after. So we have more volumetric and contour information, that kind of thing. However, if I zoom into the image, we don't have better color. So the colors that are at work there inside of the hair are just as messed up as they ever were. And if I zoom in a little more, I'll go ahead and turn that layer off once again and then turn it back on. Notice that I'm sharpening the image, meaning I'm bringing out some of that surface detail inside of the skin, which is something I might not want to do in this kind of portrait shot. So that might be a bad idea. However, that is something that happens with shadow highlight. Because it does rely on that kind of radius value, you are going to be sharpening details inside the image. So it's often a good idea, especially for portraits, to follow that up with some kind of surface detail smoothing effect. And I'll show you what that looks like after we get done modifying our default shadows highlight settings in the next exercise.